A formal good evening to all of you. On behalf of the Department of Communication, University of Hyderabad, I welcome you to the 13th Dr. C.V.S. Sharma Memorial Lecture. Uh, First of all, I'd like to extend a special welcome to our speaker for this evening, Maya Mirchandani. Uh, Before I introduce our guest, I'd like to speak a little bit about Dr. C.V.S. Sharma and the department. As many of you would know, the department was set up about more than over 30 years, way back in 1998, and in the last 30 years, it has emerged as a premier institute for media and communication studies, and has been ranked several times in a row by major surveys conducted by Outlook and India Today for its academic excellence. The Dr. C.V.S. Sharma Memorial Lecture Series is organized in memory of our esteemed colleague, C.V.S. Sharma, who was kind of one of the founding members of the department. Uh, In fact, he joined in 1987, and when it was still a discipline, we hadn't yet received statutory status. And ever since he joined us, we as students and all his colleagues used to refer to him as CVS. CVS worked with Usmania University for some time, and then he taught at Padmavati Mahila Vishwavidyalaya in Tirupati before he joined University of Hyderabad in 1987. One of the things that was special about Sharma was that he started teaching things like script writing, television analysis, and he was also a good fiction writer. Some of his works appeared in the online journal called Suleka, and a couple of them were also dramatized on All India Radio. It is unfortunate that we lost him in 2006 after he battled cancer at 48 years. We are also missing, Dr. C.V.S. Sharma's father, who used to be present with us for the memorial lectures. Uh, he passed away recently, uh, but we are happy that his son Tarun is present here with us. Uh, the C.V.S. Sharma Memorial Lecture kind of celebrates C.V.S. Sharma in the department. We started it in 2007 with Theodore Bhaskaran, and we have had eminent speakers like Amu Joseph, H.K. Dua, Colin McCabe, Paranjoy Thakurta, Venkata Chalapati, Paneer Selvan from the Hindu, Sunil Abraham, Dinesh Sharma, the science journalist, Pamela Philippos, and the filmmaker Shekhar Kamula. Last year, we had columnist and editor, the seasoned journalist, Mr. A.K. Bhattacharya, doing the lecture. I deem it a privilege to welcome Maya Mirchandani, the speaker of today's memorial lecture. Maya Mirchandani doesn't require any formal introduction, but for those who are joining in late or who may not watch too much television, she is an award-winning Indian journalist and now teaches at Ashoka University. She focuses on the principles and practice of conflict journalism, where free speech and debate are being increasingly challenged. Maya also does research at Ashoka University. She is currently a senior fellow at the Delhi based Observer Research Foundation. She is leading a research on preventing and countering violent extremism, de-radicalization, and hate speech. She hosts a regular video blog called Wide Angle with Maya Mirchandani for the Wire.in, which focuses on national security, human rights, and foreign affairs. Maya Mirchandani received a BA in history and a postgraduate diploma in mass communication and world politics. These two subjects have considerably influenced her award-winning reportage on Indian foreign policy, conflict, and national politics. Maya is an award-winning journalist. Like I said earlier, she has won the Ramnath Goenka Award twice for excellence in journalism, the Red Ink Award for reporting on human rights, as well as the Exchange for Media Broadcast Journalism Award for the best international affairs reporting. I deem it an honor to welcome Maya Mirchandani. I once again welcome all of you to this evening, and I now hand over the microphone to Maya Mirchandani to speak on the death of Indian news television. Over to you, Maya Mirchandani.
Well, thank you so much for that really wonderful introduction. And let me assure you that the honor is all mine. I have spent some years of my childhood and in summer vacations on the campus of Central University in Hyderabad. And I've also had a chance to kind of spend time at the Sarojini Naidu School as well in the city. So, you know, the fact that I'm giving a talk to the Arts and Communications department there, it's truly a privilege and an honor for me. Thank you all very much for having me give this talk. And you know, the title of the talk is rather provocative, and I've opened my computer and attempted to sort of prepare a speech on the state of Indian television ever since you all invited me and I accepted. But as someone who's entered the world of broadcast journalism, idealistic, energized, because it allowed me to combine my love for photography with my passion for the news and you know, the desire to tell compelling human stories. My attempts to actually come up with a concrete speech, so to speak, have failed. So allow me to kind of ramble a little bit as I discuss my journey, as well as where I see Indian television today. Now, my attempts have failed, to be perfectly honest, because a part of me still wants to believe that the values of a news television continue to guide many people, many of my colleagues who are still in the business. In better times, of course, we know that television and its sort of unbridled power over the way we consume and process information has been a tool for public good. We've been telling stories that have informed citizens. We've allowed them to be more critical in their questioning of the government. We've given them the information they require, you know, to hold power to account. So a part of me definitely wants to believe that those values have not died, even if today they seem like they are lying under the rubble of noise and sensationalism and propaganda that seem to dominate the airwaves today. And so, I mean, you know, just as an aside over there, a short while ago, I was discussing with a very dear friend of mine, also a former broadcast journalist, now in print, that I was giving this talk and I wasn't really quite sure what to say. And her response was, why don't you all just stand for a moment of silence before you actually start speaking? You know, so that's where a lot of us are today. But in any case, with your permission, over the next half an hour, 45 minutes or so, I'm just going to try and paint a picture for all of you about how things were, how we got here, and also perhaps find a way just to get the hell out of here as well. You know, and it's a good time to kind of talk about the state of television, because the way the coronavirus pandemic is playing out in the journalistic news landscape, both in print and in a broadcast, is sort of also giving us a window into understanding the power of traditional media. You know, print journalism, of course, has found some kind of a revival, certainly in the West, with information around the pandemic. But TV has also played its own role. I mean, we can't really wish away the power of television. In fact, TV and social media have mapped some of the greatest numbers in terms of the volume of information sharing. You've got, at any given point in time, on some news channel somewhere in the world, professionals, doctors, trained people who are imparting knowledge, information, awareness, and critique of both national governments as well as international policies towards tackling the pandemic. So I think it's really been, in a sense, a good time for journalism in general. These last few months. But, the issue about sort of before us today isn't really about the value or the power of television or broadcast media, but I think for me particularly, the process of decisions that go into deciding the headlines on any given evening. We know that TV's power is both positive and negative. In fact, this duality of our power precedes the times that we're in. And as in the past, today as well, the power flows from politics. The more divided our political sphere is, the more likely divided the media landscape, and the divisive role that media can play, whether in print or in television. But television, obviously, because of the kind of impact that the combination of sound and speech and text and video has, is really about a moral choice that editors are making. Many editors, when asked about why they make the kind of decisions that they are making today in newsrooms that I've been in, are saying that they're essentially either mirroring society or they are catering to a public demand for a particular story. But I think the question before us is, if that mirroring of society is an exaggerated mirroring, or if that public demand can also be a demand for sleaze, as we're seeing today, what can we do about it? And yet the tools we have at our disposal are very limited. As I said, it's a moral question more than a regulatory or a policy question. It is about the kind of pressure that we can apply, or our conscience can apply in the newsroom. I think, truth be told, we don't really watch all the 700 plus channels that we have in India today. So we don't know if the way television news is polarized is a pervasive nationwide phenomenon across languages, across different geographies, or whether it is a more restrictive Delhi-based phenomenon of the national media in itself. And the national media, like our political sphere, is also deeply polarized. So while you have certain channels promoting a certain kind of narrative or targeting certain groups, you have others who are still trying to do their job. Sometimes I like to say caught in an identity crisis, because the assumption is that the more sensational television channels are the ones that are garnering all the ratings. So do you chase the ratings, or do you follow what you believe are the principles of good journalism? This is a dilemma that I have faced myself in the newsroom on several occasions, and it's become a very challenging line that many of us have actually found ourselves treading, right through the last, I would say, since primarily the proliferation of private news channels in India, and then since the advent of social media and this need to follow news that is trending or viral online. As I said, that we don't know if this is really a Delhi-based phenomenon or more nationwide, because we have experience and awareness from some of the print and independent journalism counterparts across different geographies, where they are actually making, an effort to tell different kinds of stories. But we'll come to some of the prescriptives perhaps later in the conversation. Right now, I'm talking about my own journey in news television, which kind of mirrors the way private news television proliferated in India. I know TV news can be very heady. The celebrity journalist was born with a piece to camera. In fact, I'm often asked, again, I'm sort of digressing, but I'm often asked why there's no footage of me, just my voice on tape at an election rally in Colombo in December 1999, when an LTTE suicide bomber tried to target the then President Chandrika Kumaratunga, who was fighting for re-election. But to be honest, in those early days of news television, it was important for us to sign off on a story with a piece to camera. But the farthest thing on our minds while we were on the field reporting that story was to become part of the story ourselves. And so when the bomber detonated, I apologize for some graphic details here, but not far from where our tripod was, which became a bloody mess, the last thing on my mind and my camera person Gaurav Dwivedi's mind was to make sure that there was a shot of me on tape. The tripod was covered in blood and bits of flesh, and I couldn't bear to hold it. So I was wearing a dupatta, and I gave my camera person Gaurav my dupatta, and I said, "Here, you hold the tripod, and I will handle the camera," which was considerably cleaner at that point in time. And it was the farthest thing from my mind to sort of turn that camera towards myself. And it was only when I walked in, we left the scene of the explosion, and we walked in to the hotel that we were staying in, and the hotel concierge ran up to me and said, "Ma'am, can I please take you in another way?" And I got into the elevator and I took a look at my face, and I realized why he had said that. And I realized many years later why maybe a shot of me on location would have actually changed the story in itself. We reported on Chandrika Kumaratunga's election rally and the assassination attempt. That footage still makes its way to NDTV promos with my voice on tape. But when you fast forward to today, I think the truth really is that the reporter will first make sure that there is an image, there is a shot of them in the frame, and ensuring that they say, "We were here. I chased this particular individual. I'm trying to get you this story." The I has really become the focus of broadcast, and I think that's also been part of the reason for the way we have seen some of the slide in TV newsrooms across the country. But let me just go back to 1995. From just a faceless byline in a newspaper, you could put a face to a name, and it was thrilling to know, in a sense, that our voices were recognizable. We were told when we were out in the market or getting onto a flight that we had become household names. And yet, we were that not because we were sitting in a studio and shouting on television at 9 p.m. every night. We had become those names because we had gone out of our comfort zones. We had gone out of the newsroom. We brought pictures and voices to you, the viewer, from far off. We showed you both misery and glory. We showed you disaster and victory, unembellished, and we showed them to you by going out there ourselves. Broadcast journalism, especially for television, has been physically strenuous work. I mean, when I started my career, we carried very heavy equipment. We took very arduous journeys. We braved the elements. We had to get the shot. We had to get the interview. And then when we got back to the newsrooms, in a cut-to-cut world of editing, we spent hours going over our tapes, transcribing our interviews with time codes, logging our shots with time codes, and ensuring that our scripts were I'm going to quote Pranoy over here, because Dr. Pranoy Roy, who's sort of the father of private news television in India, and certainly one of my own mentors, he always demanded that our scripts must be short, layered, informative, well written, and edited all at once. And he was a compulsive copy editor. What we tried to cut down to write in 2 minutes of airtime, he would inevitably hack and make down to sort of 1 minute and 15 seconds. And you'd realize that actually you'd managed to get all the information you wanted in a tight, pacey kind of way. So, I joined the industry in the very early years of liberalization, first in the summer of 1994 as a bright-eyed intern in Newstrack. Newstrack, of course, blazed its own trail as the first privately produced video news magazine, where VHS tapes were circulated by lending libraries, on a monthly basis. And then I was, for a few months, as a junior reporter at ANI, which had become the first video news agency in in the country. It had managed to secure licenses to provide news content, video content to Reuters and the BBC. It was founded by somebody who was a senior camera person at Films Division. And so the equipment and the access to licensing and fees and things like that were made easy at that time. By 1995, however, those stints lasted a very short while. Newstrack was about 6 weeks. ANI was just under 8 months. By 1995, I was well in NDTV. The News Tonight had launched, and we were poised really for a blast off. So in a sense, like I said, my career in Indian news television and my decision to leave when I did as well is the journey of the last two and a half decades of broadcast television in India, from public to private, from recorded to live, from the field right into the studio. I mean, again, when I joined, and Newstrack really was an inspirational trailblazing product at the time, we were also a part of global change. The world was changing across, governments were being pulled down, the Cold War had ended, and Indian journalists were out there for Newstrack, getting those stories of booth capturing and political violence of the late 80s, the reservation protests and the Mandal agitation of the early 90s, the assassination of Rajiv Gandhi, the siege of Chirare-Sharif, the demolition of Babri Masjid, and of course, election analysis, live election analysis that really put Dr. Pranoy Roy on the broadcast news map, where he has sort of stayed, feet firmly planted for ever since then. And in his words, 1995 marked kind of a tectonic shift in India's broadcasting policy. News Tonight, which NDTV produced as a private production house, was commissioned by Doordarshan 2. It was on only Monday to Friday, weekdays at 9:30 p.m. We assume that the time was given because it was after Doordarshan's own broadcast. So the intention for the government broadcaster was that, well, people would have already watched the news, and if somebody wants to switch to Doordarshan 2 at 9:30, they can, but the government still retained control of the main news bulletins of the day. The assumption was that the public had got their fill of information and it wouldn't really do well. In fact, we had to submit scripts to Doordarshan. The show aired at 9:30 at night, but we had to submit our scripts to Doordarshan by 4:30 in the evening. And Pranoy and Radhika, who were very much a part of the NDTV newsroom in those early days and continue to be, their offices are just off the main news pit, in fact, even today. They made it very clear that if there was ever going to be a change in the story would be dropped. It didn't matter how important it was, we would just drop the story if we couldn't fight to retain our scripts the way we were. And I mean, there was a very sweet old gentleman named Mr. Raja in the Doordarshan newsroom at the time, in Akashvani Bhavan and in Mandi House. He would sort of flit between the two. And I remember every day at about 5:30, after he had seen the scripts by fax, and he would call up the newsroom only in the day of landlines and ask to speak to each individual reporter. And we would have, major arguments with Mr. Raja. We would first try and plead our case, then we would try and cajole, then we would sort of threaten, and one thing would always lead to another. And Mr. Raja, God bless his soul, he's not alive anymore, but he would always say, "Madam, I've got only 1 year left to retire. Please don't give me this trouble. Just do what I'm telling you to do." But it would always end in a crazy argument. But sometimes we won, sometimes we lost. That's just the way it went. But once we hit the nightly broadcast, the journey from there was extremely rapid. We've seen changes in policy, changes in technology, and the proliferation of news channels in the country. There was no question of, recorded broadcast. And I say 4:30 in the evening for the news tonight at 9:30, our tape was physically delivered to the Doordarshan production control room to air at 9:30. We then moved to a system where we could use VSAT technology and record like a broadcast shortly before the bulletin to air, about 10 or 15 minutes, I think. And it would then be used through VSAT technology to go out live. And from there on, I mean, live news television, uncensored, unfettered. And I think that's actually been one of the really major positives of Indian broadcasting, is that there was actually, for live television, no censorship. We've had industry bodies talk about guidelines. We've had learnings and lessons from mistakes that were made by people like me, my colleagues on the field. I mean, we still talk about 2611 being a case in point, where the decision to telecast live events as they unfolded was reviewed. It was reviewed because we knew at that time that the handlers of 2611 terrorists were watching Indian news television and watching that blow-by-blow account. So what could be done? And the decision for the National Broadcasters Association then to sort of say we would do it with a delayed live, we would go back to the principles of delayed lives for these situations, was a learning and an outcome of that. And the reasons for that, I mean, that's a whole different lecture in and of itself. The fact that because there is this sort of free space in private broadcasting for television news, that there were really no SOPs that even the government had in place at that time. But like I said, that's a whole different conversation and a whole different talk, perhaps. But the media landscape, so we've seen it going from just one Doordarshan to, I think at last count, we have over 700 news channels across the country, English, Hindi, and regional language news channels. But the proliferation of private broadcasting also changed the way TV newsrooms began to operate. Revenue models shifted, corporate advertising became sort of the key source of revenue, profit, and the sponsorship model began to dictate news budgets. Clearly, we know now, and hindsight is always 2020, that no model for media funding is really better than subscriptions, licenses, and independent revenue generation. But we know that's an ideal world. Once private television really became a thing, profit motives were not far behind, obviously. And in the quest for profits in an overcrowded market of news channels, there were several choices that were possible for funding, and different channels have chosen different routes. But the nature of funding has dictated, in a sense, the nature of the product that the channel brings out. We know now that media economics has collapsed, so much so that governments actually need not resort to any overt censorship. The power of 2,500 crores of advertising budgets function both as a carrot and a stick, because as economic recession of 2008, 2009, and then the slide after that, demonetization, most recently the impact of the pandemic on the economy, media revenues have been constantly hit because of truncated corporate budgets. For media houses that were relying on advertising budgets have shrunk. And the government has essentially become a single source funder for particularly television across the country. TV news is an expensive proposition, primarily because of the equipment and the costs of satellite technology and things like that, but also because of the fact that it requires many more people to do the same job. We're seeing shifts now to sort of mojo mobile journalism, one person teams who go out with a camera. I was incidentally one of the first one person teams when I was NDTV's correspondent in the United States. I did my own camera, I did my own editing, I did my own scripting, I did my own uplinking, which was sort of uploading via a file transfer protocol server into NDTV. And that model really took on because it was cheaper. I think the big problem is that instead of hedging and spreading their search for revenues across different streams, many seem to have decided that the surety of government funding is worth the moral compromise of sort of pandering to political agendas on the nightly news. And that's really, a big problem and leading to the kind of broadcasting we're seeing today. Money has poured into the media, even though many channels are not profitable, because of political interest in running some of these news channels. They have been bought by small town politicians, many of them. They want to exert influence over the media, and they're also conduits to nods in permits and contracts and things like that. And of course, with that have come all sorts of allegations of corruption, corrupt practices, in newsrooms, in individual bureaus in some cases, or with individual journalists. And I mean, I'm not going to go into names and speculating, but that has been a problem that certainly some of us who sort of want to uphold the values of good journalism, irrespective of the medium that we operate in, are constantly fighting to counter. One bad apple sort of ruins the whole basket. And I think that's really where we are today. But, how do you tackle some of these challenges? How do you tackle some of the decisions that newsrooms are taking? How do you try and impose a sense of judgment, editorial judgment, in certain decision-making processes? I think these are really the big questions for us today, but they also highlight a contradiction. And this contradiction to me is the sort of dichotomy between the right to free speech and journalistic endeavor. I've already said that essentially, it is moral pressure that you can apply, nothing else. Broadcasting, we know, is the most potent tool that any state can hope for to control. And the history of Indian broadcasting, irrespective of who's in power, has unfortunately been replete with examples of state interference and attempts at state propaganda. Things are in a much worse position today because, once again, the failure of media economics. The Supreme Court is questioning the role of news in spreading hate today. All I can say is that it's really taken them a while to get here. It's also taken an obviously bigoted show on an obviously bigoted channel to sit up and ask about guidelines. Having said that, as a caveat, there are guidelines. The National Broadcast Standards Association has a set of guidelines which most journalists adhere to. There are some who say that the guidelines are not applicable to them and have gone and set up their own parallel a Broadcast Standards Association, and that'll always happen in a space where there is this contradiction between free expression and conscience. Well, the debate on bigoted programming, frankly, is to me just a small fleck in the propaganda landscape that TV news has become today. Multiple debates have become intertwined in this conversation about the state of news television, about censorship and revenue models, and also now about regulation, also driven by this urge to find ways to regulate digital media and social media. Just as an aside, the Press Information Bureau of India still doesn't have a category for accreditation for journalists in digital media. They still have only print and broadcast, and everybody else is just a freelancer or an independent journalist. And, I don't want to get into too much on regulation because that's, to me personally, a bit of a slippery slope. Because frankly, as repulsed as we feel, and we all do, when a Bollywood suicide becomes the only story on the nightly news for weeks, in the midst of a pandemic, in the midst of an economic crisis, in the midst of a warlike situation with China, or, you have channels obsessed with the Narcotics Bureau interrogating an A-list actress when farmers are spilling out onto the streets, talking about agricultural distress, and this actress just happened to be someone who stood outside Jawaharlal Nehru University, in the winter with protesters in solidarity in the midst of anti-CAA protests. I think, there are clear indications of what's going on over there. We're also repulsed equally by visibly propagandist programming on certain channels targeting religious minorities, conflating distinctions between religion and violence, religion and patriotism, conflating distinctions between the right to protest in a democracy or the subversion of the state, conflating distinctions between, again, patriotism and critically questioning your government or the army. All of us are actually subject to, this certification, the requirement of certification from a group of people or a government who might want to control how nationalist we are or how committed we are to, democracy in terms of the will of the majority, not realizing that democratic principle really is not just about the will of the majority, but equally a protection of minorities. So, that again sort of manifests itself in the way we see TV news. I mean, just pressing on that point, when we hear talk of corruption, political corruption, it's a very potent public issue. And if my memory serves me correctly, and it wasn't that far long ago that I left television, daily news television, I think it was news television that brought political corruption to the forefront, front and center of the political debates. I mean, we were talking about the coal scam, we were talking about the Commonwealth Games scam, we were talking about the 2G scam, we were talking about all kinds of scams. And there was a sense of purpose in the fact that you were using your own journalistic inquiry, journalistic endeavor to actually talk about issues that made a difference. And one can argue with hindsight whether there were political lobbies or political groups that were also benefiting unwittingly. Journalists were giving them an unwitting benefit by the coverage on corruption. But I will still say today that there was no question about not having gone after those stories. It was important to do those stories. And, every newsroom in the country stands by the decision to pursue those stories, irrespective of where we feel we are today as a result. The fact that we seek justification for today's political crimes, maybe crimes is a strong word, but today's political crimes by sort of this whataboutery and saying, but the previous government did so and so, or another political party did such and such thing, and making that the subject of nightly news debates. I mean, it might be defense, it might be justification, but it really doesn't cut it as far as as far as the kind of concerns we are seeing that have arisen as a result of some of those decisions on programming that we see on our screens today. But again, I keep saying that the real pressure we have is moral pressure. We really don't want to, go down a regulatory rabbit hole on this, because there are pitfalls of that. And the reality, frankly, is that India and Indian news television in this regard is not unique. The Fox versus CNN wars in America are direct counterparts. We're seeing in the UK, for example, where the assumption was that BBC retains its independence because every viewer pays a license fee to the BBC, and that helps retain its autonomy because its funding is independent. The government in the UK wants to do away with the license fee, which will possibly force BBC down some kinds of decisions it would not want to take. So I think these challenges are global, and we are therefore part of the same narrative. However, national compulsions, national stories, national pressures might be different in country to country, and that's where I think that's really where the rub lies. The question is, I think, to me, is where do we go from here, and why is it that populist narratives in politics find the kind of pull on television like they do? I mean, just to sort of drive home that point, I was reading a piece today in the Financial Times about how loneliness is feeling populism. And I wonder if we can make an extrapolation from there, in a sense. If loneliness is feeding populism, is it also feeding our need to have our resentments and fears mirrored on television? Is the anchor of news becoming an extension of our voice? I mean, I suppose this is an extension of McLuhan's prophecies about how the media is an extension of ourselves, the phone extends our voice, the TV sort of extends our eyes and ears, the computer our brain, and all of it together is our central nervous system. So our fears and grievances that lie within our central nervous system, combined with budgeting crunches in newsrooms where field reporting has become expensive, and so we've moved everything into a studio debate where purportedly all sides of the debate are being represented, even if they're shouting and screaming at each other and not really allowing anyone to listen to what the argument is. I think those are really that's the crossroads of where we are at. Economic or technological success or advancement, aren't really markers necessarily of social progress, even though, we feel that they are. And how can there be intellectual growth or the need for inquiry, the need to uphold constitutional values, liberal values of inclusion, of rights, of freedoms, of the protection of minorities as the duty of a state? I mean, should newsrooms have the editorial backbone to tell us what we really need to worry about? How we can distinguish what's being manufactured? I mean, of course they do. Can where do we start? So I mean, here I'm gonna conclude now in a couple of minutes, but in terms of where we start, I think, do we want to see regulatory bodies with more teeth? I mentioned the National Broadcast Standards Association a little while ago, and I also mentioned the fact that over the last few years we've seen a parallel body come up to that, because if you look at the guidelines of what the NBSA says, the kind of orders that were being passed, the kind of violations of the guidelines and notices that were being sent out, were talking about this sort of undue tilt towards minority bashing, towards targeting certain women or stories. I mean, I mentioned the Supreme Court and the Sudarshan News case earlier, but frankly, the Supreme Court is really late in the game. The industry should be having this conversation within itself. But again, in a polarized landscape, when journalists are now polarized, how do you have this conversation? The worry is, if we don't look at ways to give more teeth, more spine to these regulatory bodies, we are running the risk of bringing in government control in a way that we don't really want it. So I think when people ask for regulation, we need to find ways to look at sort of the concerns that we have, looking at, the parameters of the IPC, perhaps getting legal representation on these boards, giving them more powers to execute some of their decisions or to impose certain restrictions, and taking it really from there. Because in the kind of populist landscape that we inhabit and that television news is inhabiting today, we need to be careful about investing too much of that power with the state. It's this state today, it could be somebody else tomorrow. And let me assure you, even if, 5 years later, another regime is in power, if there are controls on the media in place, I don't see any political dispensation wanting to roll back on any controls that might be in place. A lot of this, once again, is stemming from the kind of narratives, and I sort of touched upon that briefly earlier, the kind of narratives on social media, and this rise of hate speech and misinformation and disinformation on social media. Again, that's a core part of the research I'm doing today once I've left television, but I see it playing out on TV channels. I myself have stopped watching a lot of news television today. I see my own colleagues lament where we are. I see some of them who've left news television and moved to digital platforms, essentially taking the formats of television to those platforms. It's not that if they're doing something on YouTube or something on a Facebook platform or something like that they are doing anything drastically different in terms of formats. They're still going out, they're still reporting, they're still interviewing people, they're still, writing scripts. We call them now mini documentaries, but they were our, 1.5 2-minute news stories once upon a time. We've got OTT platforms like Netflix or Amazon Prime or whatever have you, which are becoming a space where journalists are seeking the ability to do documentaries, because there is such limited resource for field reporting, and all of it. Studio anchoring is cheap. It makes somebody a celebrity. You get the ratings. You get 2 people in. There's really, there's limited expense. And given the fact that they're not going out onto the field and they find their news pegs and news rundowns in what is trending on social media, which is combating hate speech and disinformation and misinformation, I think it's pretty evident where those editorial judgments are coming from. And I think when we look at regulation, we can't just talk about broadcast media and print media and traditional forms of media, but we need to look at the social media landscape and the digital platform landscape that we inhabit. And again, I'm just going to end it right here because I feel I'm rambling right now, but I'm going to end it on that note to say that we do need some form of I don't like the word regulation, but I'm going to use it for want of a better word. We need someone to be able to judge, maybe an ombudsman, who is outside the system, who can make an honest judgment of what is okay and what is not okay, what violates the Indian Penal Code, what doesn't, what violates our constitutional principles and what doesn't, without this need to go into, but what about this and what about 5 years ago and what about 10 years ago and what about 50 years ago. I think when journalists themselves find some way, find some support from whether it's within the media fraternity, and we have a lot of people who are actually looking for grants and finding ways to fund independent journalists. But television as a medium will always retain that power. Independent journalists are fine and they're doing stellar work, but the power of television remains the power of television. So our challenge today is not so much about finding ways to fund independent journalism, but finding ways to revive the value of traditional media, find ways to improve their funding models, find ways to revive the consumer's need for better news. And I think, that's a point I'd actually like to end on, that when you have editors saying we're giving the public what they want, that may be true, and editors should be, they've been invested with better tools than to give the public what they want. It's like saying, a child wants too much sugar. Is the parent going to give it to them, or is someone going to say, no, that's bad for you? So yes, I mean, editors and traditional media newsrooms do have that ability still. They need to find that moral pressure. But I think along with that, they also need to ask, and I would like to ask consumers of news television what it is they want to watch, why it is that they are so attracted to what they see. Why is it that all of us, in spite of our best efforts to not have a conversation about a Bollywood suicide, are asked by members of our own families, tell us what's going on. Why is this, what happened? And I think when we find the answer to that question, we might find the first step out of this rabbit hole that we're running down to. With that, I'm going to end my comments and my talk today. I hope it was insightful. Like I said, I ramble a little bit, but I'm happy to take any questions that any of you may have.
Thank you very much, Maya, for providing that overview from 1995 to today. It's indeed been a very the journey has not been smooth in a sense.
Right.
And I mean, if you look at the chat window, there are several questions that have been lined up. But before I request you to move on to the chat window, I have a question of my own.
Sure.
Clearly, broadcast television news is not in great shape today. They are setting the wrong agenda, by and large. By and large, they are setting the wrong agenda. Instead of influencing social media, they are getting influenced by social media in terms of deciding what stories go on air and so on and so forth. And they are politically divided. There seems to be a lot of influence of owners on the content that is broadcast. So basically, it's a mess out there. What advice would you give to students who are wanting to get into news television tomorrow, should they be getting into broadcast news television, or is independent news the way forward?
Well, I mean, like I said in my closing comments, of course, independent media is actually filling the gap right now for so many who want to be able to access verifiable news and information, and also look at the kind of stories that are actually demanding public attention, whether it was the migrant crisis, whether it is the farm bill, whether it is communal violence that we're seeing around the country, whether it's the state of the economy. There are a number of stories. I mean, our public health infrastructure, we can go on and on. So yes, independent journalists are filling that gap. But I think because the reach of independent journalists is limited, and they themselves are dependent on the same social media virality to actually get their audiences and get their readership as far and wide as possible, I don't think we can discount the importance of broadcast media. And I mean, to me, it's always been interesting that while television has been privatized in India, in terms of television news has been privatized in India. The government retains its control on radio, on news on the radio, and has not allowed this kind of proliferation of radio news channels across the country. I wonder why that is, and I think that's a decision that I think many governments have to answer for as well. The fact that you have sort of precedent for wanting to curb criticism of the government, critique of the government, again, over regimes, is something that, if we as journalists don't ask about it, I mean, I agree with you to the extent that I don't know if we're dominating or dictating the agenda. I think sometimes when you actually have conversations outside sort of the TV news living room, people are concerned about public health. People are concerned about, there are people who are watching some of these independent stories. I think it's, so social media and television are kind of interacting symbiotically today. So if a TV channel is putting out a problematic clip, it goes on to YouTube. From YouTube, it is shared on WhatsApp. From WhatsApp, it goes wherever, we don't know. By the same token, if there is, an independent source of video which is being circulated on WhatsApp, that's going viral too. And then television channels are picking that up. So it's working both ways. It's a very complicated landscape. And it is dominated right now by the fact that the money in television news lies with a few. And that money largely is coming from government sources. And whether editors are willfully falling in line or whether they are being forced to fall in line, we can debate that depending on individuals. But I think the fact of the matter is we can't discount the fact that we need to revive news television. We need to find a way to make it relevant again. And I started by saying that the pandemic actually gave us an insight as to how we can do it. Because in March and April, May, when the lockdown was happening, all of us were watching the evening news across TV channels. In fact, TRPs, even on the more staid channels like NDTV, saw a little bit of a bump because people were watching. Now, we can argue, and we'll probably find people to counter argue as well, that if your funding source comes from the government and you have a few who are receiving greater amounts of that money, they are more beholden to the powers that give them that money. And the economic crisis or the security crisis or the public health crisis, which asks questions of the government, is something the government may not want to dwell upon, then you circumvent the narrative. You come back and you sort of set the Narcotics Control Board Bureau onto Bollywood stars. You call up the Enforcement Directorate and get into an investigation into a suicide, which now people say was the actor really murdered. You see state politics between Maharashtra and the center playing out as well on that. So I mean, it's actually very interlinked, and I don't know if there's an easy answer to your question, but I do feel, as somebody who's I gave my life, I would still love to go back into a TV newsroom if I could do TV the way I learned how to do TV. I do feel there is a requirement and there is space for that. There's just no money for it right now.
Okay, I'll quickly take a couple of questions from the chat window. Supriya asks, do you see, I mean, the sum and substance of her question is there space for citizen journalism on social media? Is that going to be the future of the news media in India?
Citizen journalism. That's a tough one, because, I mean, citizen journalism has, to me personally, has value, and it was, we've seen it sort of happen over the last, I think I would give it about 10, 15 years where citizen journalism has become really a prominent thing. But I think there are boundaries for citizen journalism. It's fine to have a citizen journalist who is essentially doing the job of an eyewitness. A major train accident happened. I was there. I recorded this. I'm sending it into a newsroom. I witnessed this happen. And so here it is. But I think citizen journalists, if we're going to rely on them, then we need to look at creating media literacy and journalistic values, to kindergarten. Because if citizen journalists don't have the tools, don't have the experience, don't have the understanding of how to process information for public consumption. So when you're going to be unfiltered in the transmission of your information, how do you know what the impact of that information is likely to be? We have to step on eggshells. If you have religious symbols in a shot, how do you show that? If you have graphic imagery of an accident or a mutilated body or a rape survivor, there is someone who's taking those decisions based on guidelines. The citizen journalist has no awareness of those guidelines. So then do we start teaching media studies to, class 5? Maybe it's not a bad idea.
Media literacy has been a trend in several countries. They are taking it to the schools and colleges. Maybe that's one of the ways of doing it. Kulwin Trehan says, how do you look at the effectiveness of self-regulation vis-a-vis the Indian news channels? I mean, have they worked? Has self-regulation worked?
Self-regulation did work for a while. And again, I come back to my example of 2611 as a case in point, where the NBSA sat down itself and came up with guidelines after conversations. I mean, multi-stakeholder conversations. You had the government, you had journalists, you had lawyers, you had law enforcement, you had these people in the room. And then you evolved a set of guidelines. But again, I link the inability for self-regulation to go beyond a point to two factors. One is that there is no power that self-regulatory or autonomous bodies have to enforce their decisions. That's one. And the second is that when we're in a politically polarized landscape, why should journalists' bodies be less polarized? So you have the setting up of a parallel standards. They've got the money and they can do it. So I think, these conversations very often kind of veer in the direction of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So we need to be mindful of that. Self-regulation has worked in the past. It has the power to work, but it has to work on the basis of consensus. We have to find the center. If we can find the center, then I think a lot of these issues will kind of be addressed. And that center is the political center, the economic center, the social center. I mean, whatever have you. We're right now functioning on extremes. We're at, two extreme ends of ideological spectrums, and everything is being colored by that. So yeah, I don't know if I answered your question, but I tried.
Yeah, Devanshu Arya is asking, is it a good time to come back to newspapers? Let us make print great again.
Print is struggling with the cost of newsprint right now. And because the government has removed its subsidies on newsprint, print too depends heavily on government advertising, as we see when our front pages have been given up to the government every other day of the week. But I think obviously print has more protocols in place because it's a newspaper that you're seeing the next morning. There are more editorial breaks. It goes through the process differently. Live television allows for correction, but unless you have your wits about you in that moment, what's gone on air has gone on air. And that becomes a problem. So, I mean, I've been a television journalist all my life. It's very hard for me to say, should we go back to print? I chose broadcast and television for a reason. And I think the reason was that in a country where you have not the greatest literacy rates, you need to have media of communication, whereby the public is still getting the awareness and the information and the education that they need, without actually having to learn how to read or write. I'm not saying they shouldn't learn how to read or write. Of course they should. But we need to factor in literacy levels when we talk about, revivals of today. I'm sticking to that. Traditional media, whether it's print or broadcast, needs to be revived. And I keep saying television news, the way television news used to be done, has moved off television and moved onto YouTube. But it is still broadcast and television news. It's just that you're watching it on the internet and not on a TV screen.
Okay, Sujit has a question, Sujit Kumar Mohanty. Considering that the digital spaces came a little later and broadcast television arrived earlier, strategic vilification in digital space of news channels and anchors who are critical of the state and their policies has led to the creation of parallel news wars. How can legacy media counter this?
By doing what it should do. I mean, how does legacy media counter this? People are look. I mean, again, like I said, we are looking at, when we talk about the death of news television, which, like I said, was a provocative title, we are only talking about a few news channels in the country. There are still, for every one news channel that is still doing journalism the old-fashioned way, there might be 3 who are not. Or every one news anchor who believes that, this is how journalism should be done, there might be 2 who believe something different. But you do have those people. Many of my former colleagues at NDTV are still sort of, they stand in the light because they're still trying to do the job of what broadcast journalists should be doing. And I think it's very easy to taint individuals based on what you read or what you perceive. And now, everything is about clickbait and the headline. It's also very easy to believe your own circle of trust when they say, oh, so-and-so was, rubbish. Did you see what they did on TV, or did you not see what they didn't talk to this person, they didn't talk to that person, or they're so biased. I mean, I always ask, even within my own family, I always ask, when you're saying they're biased, can you tell me why? Did you watch it? Did you listen? And inevitably the answer is no. So if you're not listening, if you're not watching, how are you making this determination? And again, and that brings me to the point of asking the viewer and the consumer. It's one thing to blame the journalist, it's one thing to blame the media house, it's one thing to blame the television channel, the proprietor, the government, all of it. And they're all responsible for the mess in some shape, way, or form. But are we absolving the consumer of news completely? Can we do that? I don't know. You tell me.
Yeah, it's a two-way. Okay, I'll open up the platform for maybe another 5 questions, Maya.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be grateful if you could just choose the questions and ask me, because I think there's so much on the chat box that I don't know where to scroll up and down. So feel free to.
Usha Raman is asking, in the US and perhaps elsewhere, there has been discussion about funding the media as a public good. For example, like postal systems or the roads or hospitals, etc. Do you think that's a possible approach in India?
I do think it's a possible approach. I would welcome such an approach, but I don't think the Indian news consumer is ready for it. They're too used to not paying for news. So, I mean, if you don't pay for newspapers that have had to raise their subscription price because of the absence of any more subsidies on newsprint, are now realizing the hard way that people just don't want to pay. We don't want to pay for online subscriptions. Yeah. We're happy to be with the advertising, but we don't want to pay for online subscriptions, because why should we? We'll get it free from somewhere else. So I think, and when we see the way social media has become sort of its own force of news, we say, oh, we get our news from our news feeds on Facebook or Twitter or wherever, whatever platform they're using. People are not, you have to be able to convince the public first to pay for the public good and to see it as a public good. So if there is, again, and I come back to the polarization, if there's only one group of journalists that say journalism is a public good and you need to see it as that and you need to pay for it, and another one says, don't worry, we'll give it to you free. I don't have an answer to this question. I would love to see that kind of a model. We're seeing what's happening in Britain. They want to do away with the licenses. So, yeah. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
There are quite a few questions on the increasing dramatization of news, where news is becoming more and more difficult to distinguish between fact and fiction. So might as well, I mean, if that's become the nature of the medium, we might as well declare the obituary of the medium like your title does, and move on and seek some alternative sources of information and news which are more sober, which stick to the facts. Because the reenactments and the dramatizations and so on, we can't tell apart news television from drama television any longer.
Sure. I mean, yes, that's of course that's happened. We've seen anchors in space suits. We've seen them in bathtubs, pretending to be dead actresses. We've seen all that happen. But again, I want to come back to the same point that there are other people in broadcast media who are not doing that. And so while those individuals and those channels should definitely be censured by a regulatory body, an autonomous regulatory body, again, do we want to throw the baby out with the bathwater? I don't know any of my colleagues who are willing to enter a bathtub and pretend to be a dead actress. I'll tell you this.
How about throwing some babies out with the bathwater?
Sure, you can be selective.
No,
but at the risk of being called, no, I won't say it because we don't know who was watching. But You can. I mean, of course, there are things you can throw out. You can throw out this dramatization. You can throw out this sensationalism. To start with, you can throw out the multiple elements on your TV screen. You have a ticker on top, a ticker at the bottom, a box on the side, a graphic on the side of the screen, 7 windows. Throw it all out, because what is it all doing? It's essentially, I think and this is again, it comes back to the consumer. We are pandering to lower attention spans. Digital communication and digital technology has shrunk our attention. We've all seen the social dilemma, right? By now, I think we've all seen it. And we know how tech platforms or social media platforms are trying every second to keep our attention hooked. When we have something to stimulate our attention every second, I mean, what is sober news going to do for anyone? Again, that's a question for the consumer. You know, so I would like to see a clean screen to start with. And I think that's a small step. Can channels start to do something like that? I see people try and they fail. I made this point about an identity crisis. In my own old newsroom, every evening when we were discussing, oh, what should we do for 8 o'clock and what should we do for 9 o'clock? And no, we're not going to do what some other channel is doing. And then you'd see a breaking news flash on some other channel. Oh my God, that's breaking news. What do we do? Do we go after it? And then you have reporters saying, but that's not a story. Why should we go after it? And then somebody's saying, okay, but it's not a story, but why is it breaking on that channel? Find out. And you waste an hour in trying to find out what's going on. And an hour is a lot of time on TV. Right? So, you know, again, there are problems. There are individuals who are problematic. There are channels that have been problematic. Those channels are part of large media conglomerates that have hedged their bets. So they have somebody who's critical, somebody who's not, somebody who's middle of the road, a business channel, you know, some other publication. They're diversifying. They're hedging. That's fine. Let them do that. But, and, you know, impinging that right again becomes this argument between free speech and control. So where do we go on that? And I think whenever this question comes to me, I always end up asking, sure, there are problems with television. We know what they are. We see them every day. Some of us at least are trying to address it. How do we address the problem with the consumer? If someone gives me an answer to that, I think we might have found the opening to a solution.
Yeah, I think Devanshu kind of says, you know, the current generation doesn't like to pay thanks to socialism of so many years. Maybe the next generation will be different, and maybe they'll be willing to pay the subscription fee to get good, authentic news.
Well, yeah, hopefully. But I mean, are they not used to it because of socialism of the many years, or because social media gives them news for free?
I think Devina had a question, Masuri.
Yeah, I didn't see Devina's question.
Devina had raised a hand.
Oh, yeah. Go ahead, Devina.
Good evening, Maya ma'am and professors.
Hi.
Thank you so much. Hi, thank you so much for your insightful lecture, ma'am. It clearly spells out that the media canvas is messy. It can be overwhelming. I do believe that there are a lot of problems right now at the consumer level, of course, like you pointed. It sort of takes me back to the Roman gladiator battles, you know, that as long as you give them bread and a good show, they won't mind what the problem is with the Senate. I mean, at the individual level, I believe, yes, we can talk about how we pander to audience and what they want. We can also talk about media literacy. We can also talk about how certain journalists don't do that, and certain journalists stick to media ethics. But don't you think this is more about dismantling the inherent power structures and the way news has changed for the worse, television news? You already spoke about the funding. And I think someone in the chat also alluded to how maybe transparency to how channels are funded and which political parties are bankrolling which channels might help solve a part of the problem.
I agree. I think that there should be transparency in funding, and really at the root of a lot of the mess we're in is this sort of funding revenue pattern. I know that some of the digital media platforms are transparent. They put their funding sources out in the public domain regularly. I know that many news companies now that are at least listed publicly also have their books out in public. But I think it's the smaller channels that have political ownership and are not listed publicly or don't disclose that information that become part of the problem. With some of the big mainstream channels, look, we know who owns them. We know where their money is coming from. We also know who they're dependent on for funding. So transparency is a good thing, but is it? I don't know if it's really going to be the answer. It's not a silver bullet. I mean, yes, be transparent, of course, but I don't think that'll solve the problem. I don't know if that answered your question. I never have answers. Every question is answered with another question. That's just the way I operate, both in the classroom as well as on the field. So I feel it leads you to more discovery. So maybe that's just me.
Okay, we'll have two more questions. If someone wants to ask those questions, please go ahead. Raise your hand so we can. Okay. Darya Nani has a question. Please go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yes, good evening, ma'am. So I'm Lavina Daranani and I'm a journalism student from Chennai. Yes, ma'am. So all of us know like how the mainstream media channels, they get the attention of the viewers because, you know, they have the power to mold the perception of the audience by the way they portray a particular story. So, like what I would like to know from you is on a personal level right now, as I am studying, like before I join some media house, what kind of stories can I cover to create an impact, like using social media as a platform?
It really depends on the kind of stories you want to tell. I think, I spent the better part of my television career reporting on foreign policy and national security, and obviously elections and all, because every TV journalist has no choice but to go on the field when there's a nationwide election. But I can't tell you what kind of stories you should do. I think your gut has to speak to you about what kind of stories. I was always inspired by reporting on identity conflict. I mean, I remember when I was 13 years old and my father was on an assignment in the United States, and the first Iran-Iraq war was brewing. I was not even 30. I was, I think, 11. It was in 82. The Iran-Iraq war was brewing, and I saw Dan Rather of CBS News in a flak jacket on the field, and I saw a Time magazine cover with Ayatollah Khomeini and sort of, his role in Iran and the revolution. And I'm a history student. I'm an international relations student. It was fascinating to me. I just wanted to know what was going on. I said, if I ever be a reporter, and it wasn't even about reporting in terms of writing. I wanted to be a photojournalist. So actually, television kind of combined my love for photography with journalism. It was a perfect medium for me. But I wanted to tell the stories of conflict. I was very clear about wanting to tell the stories, not of like caste conflict and gender conflict and economic conflict. I wanted to tell the stories of war and conflict. And so that's where I went. That's what I tried to do. Even in my national reporting on national security, it was inevitably from conflict zones. I was in the Northeast, I was in Kashmir, I was in Chhattisgarh and Bastar, but it was driven by that. So that was my choice. That wasn't a choice that was thrust upon me. I made that choice. So you need to decide what it is that moves you, what stories move you. Do you want to tell stories about crimes against women? Do you want to tell stories about caste politics? Do you want to tell stories about rural distress? I don't know. But whatever you do it with your heart in it, and do it with empathy. I think that's what journalists miss on the ground today. A reporter's greatest tool on the ground is empathy. It is the ability to observe. It is the ability to listen. It is the ability to just, when you're in a car, don't be glued to your phone. Look out the window. You don't know what you're going to see. Be curious, be empathetic, and learn to listen.
Yes, ma'am. Like, it's difficult for me to kind of shortlist it this time because I'm confused. There are like various things I want to go out and cover, but restricting myself to one particular kind of beat is something that I don't know. I feel like it tampers me like to a certain
You'll find
extent.
your way. You'll find your way.
Yeah, hopefully, eventually with time. Yeah. Thank you, ma'am.
All right.
We'll take 3 more questions, one from Rashmi Chauhan, one from Matthew, and one from Cecilia. First, Rashmi Chauhan.
Yes, thank you so much, sir. Good evening, ma'am. It was really pleasure listening to you because, learning from your experiences from the field, it's very important for the faculty and students alike in the journalism field. I have this question. You touched upon the point of, can we entirely absorb the viewers, right? Twice you touched upon this point. I would like to tell you that recently I was going through the data from BARC, which actually it calculates the TRP. And if I'm allowed to name the channel here, of course, Republic TV was on the top, and it was remarkably ahead of other news channels in terms of the points. Right, and somewhere it was distressing for me because हमेशा लोग ये बोलते हैं that television में तो ऐसे ही दिखाते हैं. But again, TRP, as we know, and if my understanding is right, it also largely depends on what is it that viewers are watching. Right. So how do we address this thing? Because it bleeds, my heart bleeds जब लोग ये बोलते हैं कि अरे मीडिया तो यही दिखाता है, वही लोग दिखाते तो हम क्या कर सकते हैं, right? So can we possibly address it, or is it just a dead end?
मीडिया दिखाता है, कुछ मीडिया जरूर दिखाती है, आप देखते भी हो, रेटिंग्स वहीं से आती हैं, है ना? तो रिमोट आपके हाथ में है ना,
व्यूअर्स,
हाँ, आपके हाथ में है.
Absolutely.
तो आप चैनल बदल दीजिए, चैनल बदल के देखिए तो सही, आगे बात करेंगे.
True. So that's what I really tell my students as well, that we can't really blame media, because I do not want them to reach a state of hopelessness where they see, अरे journalism में कुछ बचा नहीं है. So, I keep on emphasizing this point that viewers are equally responsible. But, just wanted to know from you and all those people who are in journalism, working from field, that, it's not a dead end. Like, somewhere we are also responsible. How to address this, as you said?
It better not be a dead end. I'm teaching media studies every day, and they're hoping to go out and get jobs. So, we are investing our faith and our trust in the next generation of journalists. There are students who are out there who are hoping to sort of go out and do good work and blaze a trail. So, we're hoping that they'll be able to.
Yeah. So I hope somewhere you would be able to dismantle this thing that, media तो यही दिखाता है, इसलिए हम यही देखते हैं, हम क्या कर सकते हैं इसमें,
बहुत कुछ कर सकते हैं. आप रिमोट अपने हाथ में रखिए, चैनल बदल दीजिए, बहुत कुछ बदल जाएगा.
All right. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Vasuki, there is one question on Facebook from Professor Sunil Behra.
Please.
One of our senior media academics in the country. As someone who has, moved from practice to teaching, practitioners have always tended to tell academics that we are out of sync with what is really happening out there. Now that you have become a teacher yourself, what do you think we should be doing about the curriculum that it is so out of sync with what is really happening in newsrooms and in television channels?
Oh, that's a tough one. You were going to get me into trouble with a question like that, I think. um, well, I think for one, there needs to be a little more impetus on field work. I don't know how universities can work around constraints of sending students out into the field independently, but I think it's really important. I mean, from my own experience, and you hear academics say, oh, but how is that different from vocational training? It drives me nuts to hear something like that, frankly, because it is very different. Teaching students, you can't teach someone empathy. They have to get out onto the field and experience it for themselves. If they don't get it, you'll be able to tell them where they're going wrong, but I can't report for them, right? So I think to me, while I think academics play a role, and I kind of am in that in-between space right now, because all of my research is also on the information landscape and misinformation and computational propaganda and things like that. I think it's important for academics to sit back and sort of take a detached view of the processes by which news media is impacting the public. I think that would be something useful for academics to do. Because if journalists can understand the impact of their work, then maybe practitioners can help them do it differently. Was that diplomatic enough?
Okay. Yeah. So, time for one more question. We have time for one more question. I don't want to sound like, television anchors, but yeah, we have time for one more question.
Television anchors cut you off and say, that's it, 30 seconds to go,
30 seconds.
and we're out. So,
Anybody who wants to raise a hand and ask a question, please? Nivedita has a question. I'm guessing that will be the last question for the day. Is there any way to ask the government on the way it funds certain news channels? It funds certain news channels much more than it does the others. Is there a body or a court or someone we can approach
the RTI.
for unbiased funding by the government?
I think to find out how much the government is spending on which TV channel or which print media, I mean, you can file an RTI application. I'm sure that information can be pulled out of the INB ministry. Can we ensure that they fund unbiased media? I don't think we can really ensure anything. We have to just be able to know where their money is going and ask them why they're not giving it to more people or to somebody else. Why this person? Why not that person? But we can't, I don't know if you can, and why, I mean, I think here's my other really big issue. Why are we as journalists expecting the very people we are supposed to be questioning to fund us? Right? It's a no-brainer to me. So,
yeah. Thank you so much, everybody, for participating and asking so many questions. Thank you so much, Maya, for patiently taking so many questions.
well, thank you for having me.
And in person. Thank you for the insightful talk. You threw light on so many points that we have been pondering in the department as well. Thank you so much for being with us today evening. As soon as the the talk is on YouTube and other places. I'll share the link with you and on social media platforms. Thank you so much for being with us. And my colleagues, our alumni, our students, our research scholars, all of you who were with us today evening, thank you so much again and again. See you all again in the next event.
Yes, and inshallah that might be on in person rather than on Zoom. So
We hope.
hope for that. Yes. Thank you very much for having me. It's really truly been an honor. Thank you all.